Chairman. Articles of Confederation now resolve this convention. The national government ought to be established. Consent to this Constitution.
Welcome back for Lesson 2, The Birth of a Nation. Jefferson was caught up in the spirit of independence that rose sharply throughout the colonies during the spring of 1776. By that time, Thomas Jefferson had already discovered the basic principles that eventually was incorporated into the Constitution of the United States. Although he might not have realized it at the time, he was going to have supreme difficulty in getting these ideas accepted. Nevertheless, he was probably the best prepared of all the founders to launch the campaign. Now let us explore some of the events that led to the birth of our great nation. 1776. Wasn't that a great year in America? Oh, wonderful year. Fireworks happening, parties, celebrations, all those things. 1776 was probably the most difficult year that America has ever experienced, even to this day. Very, very difficult. The things that were happening, they were coming to a realization that they were having to separate from the country that they had loved. They had always believed that they could make things work, and so it was a very difficult time. They were at war with their mother country, and so even though we celebrate it today, it was a very difficult year for Americans at the time. And it was a particularly difficult year for Thomas Jefferson. Difficult is your first blank on the top of, or middle of page 9. And this is why it was difficult for Thomas Jefferson. He had a daughter that had died. His wife was extremely ill. His mother had died in March of that year. And his sorrow and concern and worry over the state of the country had given him severe migraine headaches that would last for weeks at a time. Sometimes he'd keep himself shut up in his room, and he would only just accept food from time to time, and he didn't want to talk to anybody. These headaches really gave him a hard time. But he was especially worried about the state of Virginia, and about Virginia working out her sound system of self-governance. So he wrote 3 constitutional drafts in 5 weeks. Your next 2 blanks there for number 1. 3 and 5. Now, I don't think there's any one of us here that could write 1 constitutional draft in 5 weeks, let alone 3 constitutional drafts. Jefferson was a very, very brilliant man. Now, all but a small section of the last draft was rejected by the Virginia legislature. Instead, Virginia decided to adopt a constitution that retained many of the weaknesses that had existed under British rule. Now, there's a couple of these weaknesses listed here. The first one, slavery. Now, why is Thomas Jefferson criticized because of slavery?
Yes,
because he owned slaves. That's right. So a lot of times people think, well, there's this major conflict. While he's working out the Declaration of Independence and talking about people being free, at that very time he had slaves that were taking care of his plantation and things. And so he's definitely criticized by this. But does anybody know where Jefferson got his slaves?
He
inherited them. That's right. He had some, and then when he married his wife was a Randolph, very, very wealthy in the area. He writes in his journal that his estate about exactly doubled when he married his wife. And so his wife had some slaves too. Now he inherited them, his wife inherited them. And because of some of the laws that existed, it was very difficult and illegal in some ways to be able to free those slaves, because he was basically the family trustee. He didn't necessarily really own them. They were left to him or to the estate, and then he had to leave them to the estate as well. And so there were some legal issues there. There's also a lot of difficulty. Jefferson knew that to free the slaves overnight would cause a lot of problems. And the way that he knew this was because when he's reading about the Israelites, he learns that when the Israelites get out into the wilderness, what's the first thing they do as soon as things get a little hard? Oh, the flesh pots of Egypt, they said. We want to go back. And so what did God do when they were there at Sinai and they rejected? See, God brought them to Sinai to show himself to all of the people, not just Moses. And the people said, no. You just go up and you talk to God for us. They were a little nervous about that. And so they had rejected this higher law that God was going to give them. And so what did God do? What did he make them do for 40 years?
Wander
Wander around. Why did they have to wander around?
To get rid of the slave mentality.
That's exactly right. So that upper generation was basically killed off before they went into the promised land and were able to be free. So Jefferson knew that you had to slowly work through things, but he also knew that it had to be as rapid as possible because he absolutely had a conviction that slavery was a terrible, immoral practice. So he had a plan. In fact, Jefferson had this ideal plan for freeing the slaves, and he tried to pass laws in Virginia that made it so that every person born in Virginia would be born free. Wouldn't that take care of it? It would take a little bit, it would take a generation, so that it would be slow enough that it wouldn't totally damage our economy, and that slave mentality could kind of start being worked out a little bit. And then once they got into that second generation, or these new children that were raised up, then they'd be free and they'd understand freedom and things. So that was Jefferson's plan. It was a fantastic plan. But he really struggled with slavery. And so him and some of the other founders, especially George Washington, because they had these slaves that they had inherited, the best they could figure that they could do is to treat those slaves like family, to educate them. We know a lot about Thomas Jefferson and Monticello because his slaves kept journals. They were very, very literate, very well educated, and so they kept journals, and so we know a lot of the events that took place there. We also know that they loved him, for the most part, a great deal, and they would be so happy when he'd come home. And so Jefferson and Washington and others, they determined to be a good steward. They also determined that they were not going to buy and sell slaves to split families up and things like that, and so they did not engage in that slave trade practice. And so they kind of did with it the best that they could. Now, all of that isn't a justification for slavery, and they never tried to justify that. They just did the best they could under the circumstances. And it's unfortunate that we had to end the practice the way that we did. But the founders did put some things in place. In fact, last time I visited Monticello a few years ago, and then I went to Madison's place just down the road a little ways to Montpelier. And when I was at Madison's place, the tour guide kept saying that it was such a conflicting era because of slavery and them working out freedom, and that the founders never addressed the issue of slavery. They kept putting it off to future generations. And that tour guide kept saying that, said it 3-4 times, and finally I couldn't bear it anymore. And so I said, and I tried to be polite. I said, now didn't Jefferson try to pass laws that would have freed the slaves in one generation? And the tour guide said, well, yeah, I guess he did. I said, and didn't Madison try to put right in the Constitution provisions to eventually get rid of slavery? Yeah, I guess he did. And didn't Jefferson put the slavery issue right there against the king in the Declaration of Independence? Oh, yeah, I guess he did. So they didn't put off the issue of slavery for future generations. They did lay a groundwork that eventually freed the slaves. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of get into the Constitution and learn a little bit about how that Constitution is a freeing document and not a document of captivity. So he's criticized about slavery, but he was trying to work slavery out. The next item that they kept in their government there in Virginia was primogeniture, letter B, primogeniture, which is the rule under which inherited property went exclusively to the oldest son. So all the property had to go to the oldest son or the oldest living relative. Now, are there any oldest daughters here? All right, a couple of you. Do you have any younger brothers? How do you feel about this? And sometimes if there wasn't an oldest son, it would go to a distant relative that perhaps had no relationship with the family. And so sometimes that distant relative would come in and actually just kick everybody off the estate and would take it over. And so you really ended up with a bad situation. Jefferson said that as long as this kind of thing exists, you never have the total right and control of your property, and if you don't have the total right and control of your property, you're not free. And so he said this stuff's got to do away with. And the next one has to do with this as well, entailed estates. This made it unlawful for heirs to divide the estate up. Now see, this all comes from feudal law. Now what feudal law is it's this idea that there's a king, and he owns all the land, and he lets you live on the land and cultivate it and things for exchange of taxes, and that you basically pay homage to him, which means that you pay the taxes and that you also fight for the king. Not just to protect the property, but fight to expand the property if he wants to go out on a conquest. And so that's kind of this feudal law. Well, obviously, under this system of government, they want to keep the ruling class in power. And so the way they do that is they keep all the land bottled up. And the way you keep the land bottled up is it's got to stay in the family, and the family can't divide it up. So people can't own land if you're not born into it. And so that's basically feudal law that Jefferson was trying to do away with, but Virginia kept. The other one, letter D, the official state church was left in power. And he thought this was terribly immoral because letter E, people were taxed to support the official church, whether or not they were members of that church. Can you imagine that today, that you're being taxed to pay money for a church that you perhaps even strongly disagree with some of their religious tenets or doctrines and things? And so he said, we've got to have total freedom of religion, but even freedom of property, and not have to be forced to pay for things that have nothing to do with us. And so he was against that and tried to do away with those things. And so it was a long time. Jefferson started working these ideas out in his early years, and when he finally got them in place with the Constitution, of course he wasn't there at the Constitutional Convention, but his influence was certainly felt there. You're looking at a 30-year period that it took for him to kind of start working these things out. They were rejected very, very strongly initially. So Jefferson was probably the best prepared of all the founders to launch this movement on this new idea of freedom and liberty of the individual. And the reason why he was so well prepared is because he was very well educated, even to modern standards. In fact, you'll see there in letter A. He began studying Latin, Greek, and French at the age of 9. He entered the College of William and Mary at 16, graduated at 18, came under the tutelage of George Wythe, the first law professor in America, and so he really was very, very well versed. And so here's a summary under letter B of his educational background. He gained proficiency in 5 languages. You're blank there, 5 languages. Now, most of the time, the reason why Jefferson and other founders learned other languages was so that they could read the writings of philosophers in their original tongue, so that they didn't have the damaging effects of the filtering effects of translation. And so they wanted to read it in their original tongue. Number 2, he studied the Roman classics. He studied the Greek classics, and he studied European history. So your blanks there, Roman, Greek, and history. And he discovered through this study that the British, as your blank for number 6, the British, which demonstrated that they had, through the period of over 1,000 years, had done more to try to reestablish the rights of man than any other nation throughout that time period. And you just go back up to number 5. He carefully studied the Old and New Testaments. Jefferson was a great biblical scholar. He was a deeply religious man. Now, today, historians tell us that he was a deist, or at best a deist, or an atheist. This actually started in his day, to call him an atheist or a deist. And the way that started was when he was running for president, there were still a couple of states that still had state-sponsored churches. And they knew that he was totally against that. Now, Jefferson was the 3rd president. So here we are, 3 administrations into the Constitution existing, and there are still a couple states with state-sponsored churches. How is that possible? Why didn't the federal government stop those state-sponsored churches? Because they had no authority. That's right. What does the Constitution say? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. No law. Not for, not against. Nothing. Hands-off policy. Okay, so that's why they still existed. Exactly. But they were afraid that once Jefferson became president, he was going to push it through. Did he? No. Why? No authority. In fact, Jefferson, when he was the governor of Virginia, he declared a day of thanksgiving and prayer. And when he became the president, a bunch of churches came up to him and said, hey, can you declare a day of thanksgiving and prayer? No, can't do it. What are you talking about? You did it in Virginia. Well, I had authority in Virginia. I don't have authority here. See, they understood this principle of delegated authority very, very well, and which level you do things and how you do things. And so Jefferson stayed true to that for the most part. And so Jefferson, but he was very deeply religious, but he kept his religion very close to him. He believed that religion was a relationship between an individual and God. He believed church is a relationship between community and God. He separated the two. He believed they were two very different things. He attended church all the time because he felt it was important to remind each other what our duty is to each other in relation to God. But when it came to religion, he kept that very close to his chest. And so, but deeply religious and a great biblical scholar. In fact, if you go to a bookstore today, you'll find a book that's called the Jefferson Bible. And a lot of people will say, see, that proves he was an atheist. He had his own Bible. Well, obviously they've never looked at what's in that Bible. What Jefferson did is he took two copies of the Bible and he cut out all of the words of Christ. Now, see, you need two because you got double-sided pages, right? So you had to be able to get both sides of the page. And so he cut them all out and he pasted them in a book because he thought that the words of Christ were so pure and so sublime that he didn't want them corrupted by any commentator, even the apostles. You see? He just wanted them pure. And he kept that book with him all the time, Jefferson Bible. So you can still buy it today. Basically, it's an only red letter edition. So very, very religious and a great scholar of the Bible. Most of the founders were. Number 7, students of ancient Israel and early English history can compare their respective institutions of government and find striking similarities. So you have these ancient principles that Jefferson discovered in the English history and in ancient Israel. And both of those ancient civilizations had the first forms of representative, your next blank, representative government. So there's a gentleman that came across Thomas Jefferson once and just started a conversation with him, and he had no idea who he was talking to. He didn't realize that this was the Thomas Jefferson. So he's having this conversation with him, quite lengthy, and this is what he said about him. Under letter C, on the top of page 11, when he spoke of law, I thought he was a lawyer. When he talked about mechanics, I was sure he was an engineer. When he got into medicine, it was evident that he was a physician. When he discussed theology, I was convinced he must be a clergyman. When he talked of literature, I made up my mind that I had run against a college professor who knew everything. So that's Thomas Jefferson, very, very intelligent. And politics wasn't even his first love when it came to his study. He loved agriculture and botany and things like that, science. And so politics, he just ended up having a special knack for it. Now, in 1776, do you know what the number one question that the founders had? It wasn't, could we defeat the largest army in the world? It wasn't, should we declare independence? It wasn't even what kind of government should we have? The number one question that they were asking themselves, are we good enough to be free? Isn't that an interesting question? Are we good enough to be? You have to be good to be free. Because in order to be free, there are principles of liberty. And with every principle of liberty that we have, or every right that we have, there is a responsibility or a duty, right? We have the total right and control of our property. But we have the duty to respect the rights of others, the property of others. Now, if all of us were respecting the property of others, would we have need to worry about our property? No. You see, we'd live in a peaceful society if everybody did their duty by respecting each other's property. And so with every right, we have a duty. And so their question was, are we good enough to fulfill our responsibilities and our duty when it comes to freedom? And a lot of them didn't think so. You had John Dickinson, who didn't believe that we were good enough to be free, and so he had some issues there. And Patrick Henry was struggling with it. Until they started seeing some of these founders, kind of this cream rising to the top, and they realized how much integrity some of these people had. And they realized maybe we are good enough to be free. And right about then, Thomas Paine came out and wrote a little pamphlet called Common Sense, which is your next blank there on letter A, Common Sense. Sold over 120,000 copies. At that time, that's pretty amazing. There's only 4 million people. And 120,000 copies was quite substantial in the time. Now in this, Thomas Paine basically said we are good enough to be free. He said we're good enough to be free because we don't spend all of our time trying to find entertainment and worldly things and pleasure and all that kind of stuff. Of course, he's talking then, not now, right?
Yeah, obviously.
And he said we're also good enough to be free because we understand some of these principles and we're good to each other for the most part. And he said we're good enough to be free because just about everybody owns property. Isn't that interesting that he said that owning property prepares you for being free? And now, what's fascinating about that is you kind of look at that. If you look at the rural communities or suburb areas or whatever where a lot of people own property, they tend to be more freedom-minded than when you get everybody together in a larger, congested city area where people don't own property, they don't cultivate their own property and things, they tend to be less freedom-minded. So it's fascinating that property has that effect on you. So that's basically what Thomas Paine kind of outlined. He said, we are good enough to be free. And as it says there in the bottom of the paragraph in letter A, George Washington said that this little pamphlet worked a powerful change in the minds of many men. And so George Washington and Thomas Paine really cooperated quite a bit together when it came to inspiring the people during the Revolutionary War. And what's fascinating about that is George Washington, a deeply religious man, and Thomas Paine was not a religious man. In fact, he kind of bounced back and forth between being a deist and an atheist. And so here you have atheism and a great religious man being able to work together with the same principles, with the same message, and with the same inspiration to inspire the people. And so this kind of tells us how we should be working more together on our commonalities rather than finding the things that divide us and separate us, because were two polar opposites when it came to their religious beliefs. So now we're going to quickly go through kind of some of the events that led up to the Declaration of Independence. Letter B, on March 17th, Washington's forces liberated Boston. That was pretty important because that's kind of where the whole thing happened, right? Boston was the powder keg of the Revolution. So it was important to get in there and have that, that message that America could recover Boston. On May 4th, Rhode Island jumped the gun and declared independence all on her own, as if she could defend herself, right? We were doing a seminar a couple years ago up in Connecticut, and there were a couple gentlemen from Rhode Island, and when that comment was made, as if they could defend themselves, they got offended. What do you mean we can't defend ourselves? Rhode Island's got this great independent spirit, still do. Well, Rhode Island declared independence all on her own. And then a couple of the other states followed suit as well. And then on May 10th, Congress authorized each colony to set up its own government, independent of the crown, because what ended up happening prior to the Declaration of Independence, King George disowned America, basically said, all right, you're on your own. And so Congress said, all right, I guess go set up your own forms of government. Now, what's interesting about this is that there are two states that already had a constitution for well over 100 years. And that was Connecticut, right? Remember Thomas Hooker? And then Rhode Island adopted a constitution almost identical to the one in Connecticut shortly after Connecticut's was established. So those two states remained among the most stable of the colonies for this 100-year period, building up to the Revolutionary War. It carried them right through the Revolutionary War, and so they were already prepared. But these other states weren't. They had to go back and establish their forms of government as well, and so they did so. So then on May 14th, letter E, Jefferson arrived in Philadelphia as a delegate to Congress, but he didn't want to be there. He wanted to be in Virginia, where he could help Virginia work out her system of government. And so what he did is he wrote a petition of leave of absence to Congress to ask if he could leave, and that leave of absence was denied. Denied is your next blank. Denied. Good thing it was denied, because what would he have not been there to write? The Declaration of Independence. That's right. So then on June 7th, next blank for letter G, that's when Richard Henry Lee gave the famous motion that these states are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And so this began the debate on the Declaration of Independence. Now what ended up happening was they had to take a recess, because those delegates, many of the delegates had to go back to their states. What did they have to go back to their states for? Instruction. That's right. Some of them didn't have the authority to vote for this. Some of them had no idea how they should vote because they didn't have the authority. They understood this concept of the delegated rights, that you only have the authority that the people give you. And if you don't have the authority, it doesn't matter how great the issue is. It doesn't matter if it can save every person in the whole world. You still have to have the authority in order to vote for it and make the decision. So they had to go home to get that authority or to get the direction on which way to go. Some of them already had it, but others had to leave. So in the meantime, on June the 11th, your first blank there on top of page 12, Congress went ahead and established a committee to begin drafting a Declaration of Independence while these others were off getting permission. And so that committee consisted of 5 individuals: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Now, Livingston, Sherman, and Franklin, they were involved with some other committees and things, and so they didn't participate a whole lot. So it really came down to Adams and Jefferson. And they had a little conversation about who should write the Constitution. And so John Adams recorded, "Jefferson proposed to me to make the draft. I said, I will not. You should do it." Jefferson, "Oh, no, why will you not? You ought to do it." Adams, "I will not." Jefferson, "Why?" Adams, "Reasons enough." It's kind of a silly way of talking, isn't it? What do we say, like here in the South and in the West and stuff? We would just say, just because. But up in New England, they're all proper. Reasons enough, right? And so we have some New Englanders here with us. So Jefferson, "What can be your reasons?" Adams, "Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular, and you are very much otherwise." Was he? Yeah, he was a little obnoxious, suspected, unpopular. And it's a good thing, because do you know what we have John Adams to thank for?
Is it the Alien and Sedition Act?
The Alien and Sedition Act? Well, once he was president, yeah. But a fundamental principle, and that's a bad thing that we have him to thank for him, but one of the good things is separation of powers. See, John Adams was the one that went and he studied Polybius, who talked about mixed forms of government, and he went and studied Montesquieu, that kind of expanded on the mixed forms of government, how we should divide government into a legislative, an executive, and a judicial branch. And so he went on and studied these things, and he started bringing them out there. And do you know what most people, how they reacted to it? Oh, no, this is no good. We don't want this. In fact, one of the last converts was Benjamin Franklin. But it's a good thing that he was stubborn, because when he was writing that Constitution for Massachusetts, when he was participating, he kept saying, this has got to happen, and all the rest of the delegates got so upset, they finally said, whatever, if you want it, you just write it. So we did. He wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, put separation of powers, checks and balances in place, and he helped teach people the importance of it. Now, once the idea started catching on, people thought, okay, yeah, let's separate them completely. Oh, totally separate. They don't even interact. No. You separate them, and then you come back and you carefully stitch them back together with a system of checks and balances. You see? So that's John Adams. Now, there's a great movie that was recently produced by HBO a couple years ago called John Adams, written or filmed and based off of McCullough's book. And that movie is very, very accurate. Fantastic if you haven't watched it. It's just a great thing. Now, there's a scene there that I love, because John Adams is sitting there. He's in Holland or just talking to some Dutch bankers, and those bankers are deciding whether or not to extend some credit to the United States. And finally, after working through this for quite some time, they finally tell John Adams, we will go ahead and extend, $4 million credit to the United States. And John Adams is very appreciative. And they said, well, your country should be grateful for your stubbornness. Basically, because that's why they're giving it, because they're just tired of listening to him. And in that scene, John Adams said, I am very grateful for my stubbornness as well, and I consider it a gift from God that I'm grateful for, because I'm always right. So he's a little obnoxious. But to Jefferson, he said, you are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. Now, Adams was a fantastic writer. I think he was saying this just to butter Jefferson up a little bit. But Jefferson said, well, if you're decided, I will do as well as I can. So that's how Jefferson came to write the Declaration of Independence. When Jefferson was later asked about this conversation that John Adams had recorded, Jefferson simply said, John's memory is failing him, so he indicated this conversation maybe didn't exist, but Adams wrote it down nevertheless. So for 17 days, 17's your next blank, Jefferson worked on this draft, and he wrestled with it and wrestled with it. Now, there's a few major parts to the Declaration of Independence. The first two paragraphs, then you have the list of grievances, and then you have the conclusion. Now, we know that list of grievances, which is the largest part of the Declaration, we know that wouldn't have taken him more than about a day, about 1 day, which is your next blank. And the reason why we know that is because he already had it written in a couple other documents. So it's just a matter of copying it over. He made a couple of minor changes here and there, but he just copied that right over. So what did he do for the remaining 16 days? He wrestled over 2 paragraphs because he wanted to make sure he took all these ancient principles that he'd been discovering and put them into those 2 paragraphs. Now here's a man that can, remember, he wrote 3 constitutional drafts in 5 weeks, and now he takes over 2 weeks to write 2 short paragraphs. You can see how he kind of just wrestled through it and really, really struggled. But nevertheless, he was able to incorporate many of these ancient principles into those first 2 paragraphs. 2 is your blank, the top of page 13, letter C. And so we're going to touch on a few of these principles. There are 8 fundamental principles here that he addressed in those 2 paragraphs. Number 1, sound government should be based on self-evident truths. Self-evident, your blank there. Now, self-evident truth is something that is so obvious that it's beyond reasonable dispute. Right? The sun is shining. Okay, that's beyond reasonable dispute on a sunny day, of course. And so these things are so simple and so easy to understand, you can't dispute them. Number 2, the government of mankind here on earth should be based on the law of nature and of nature's God. Now, you've probably heard the term natural laws, right? And they used to teach natural law in school quite a bit, but they don't teach it anymore. And so when we hear it, it's kind of foreign to us. And then when we start learning that we should learn natural laws and understanding them, then you want a listing of those laws, don't you? Well, tell me what they are. Well, you can't really list them because they're so numerous. But basically, in a nutshell, a natural law is just the way things are. It's simply the way that the Creator or the way that nature has set things on their course. So, for example, there's different natural law principles for science. What goes up must come down, equal and opposite reaction, things like that. There's certain natural law principles for human happiness. For example, if you want to get along with your neighbor, don't kill him. Don't kill your neighbor. You won't get along very well if you do that. If you want to get along with your friends and family and things like that, it's suggested don't lie. That's not that good of an idea. So you don't want to lie. You should respect your parents. They've got some good advice, and so you honor your mother and your father. And if you want to have a good marriage that's long-lasting, keep adultery out of it. Okay, it's usually a good idea. Just stay away from adultery, right? And so there's all these laws for human happiness. If you want to kind of be able to recharge your brain and kind of have a way to keep moving forward, and then take 1 day a week and set it aside for studying God's law. Okay? And then worry about the rest of your life the other 6 days and just set that 1 day aside. Now what am I going through in the 10 Commandments? See, the 10 Commandments aren't some magical, mystical, religious thing. They are natural law principles for human happiness. If you do them, you're going to be happier. You don't do them, you're not going to be as happy. Simple as that, okay? So natural law, that's natural law. It's just simply the natural course of things. And so that's exactly what Jefferson's talking about here. He's talking about natural law and the laws of nature. And then he throws in that those laws were established by God, okay, and of nature's God. Now this presupposes as self-evident truth that the Creator made human beings equal. Equal. The other thing that this kind of presupposes is if the Creator made us equal, what does that mean that there is?
No slavery.
Well, there shouldn't be any bondage and stuff, but if there's a Creator, or if we are created, then there must be a Creator, right? Okay. And so again, when people are talking about the founders being atheists and things, it's clear that nature's God is a very faithful statement, and then also just simply talking about the Creator making us. But we're equal in only 3 ways. You know, if you look around the room, it's very clear that we're not equal. We come in all different shapes and sizes, right? And if you started going around the room to see what our talents are and what our income is and all that, very different. So talents are different. Outcome is different. So we are not equal in those ways. Nature has never made us equal in those ways. But we are equal in 3 ways. Letter A, we're equal in our rights. Letter B, before the bar of justice, or I like to just simply say under the law. In our rights, under the law, and the last one, in the sight of God. Now what's fascinating about this is that the moment we try to make ourselves equal in other ways, look at what happens. If you've got somebody who has $10 and another person who has $20, and you want to make them equal in things, what do? $20 gives $5 over to now they both have $15. Now what have you just made them unequal in? Unequal in their rights, because now the $20 person doesn't have as much right to their property as the $10 person, and unequal under the law, because it's presumed that in order to do that, you would pass laws to shift that money over. So that's fascinating. If you want to look at laws to see if they are a violation of rights, just simply see if whatever the law is, if it makes us unequal in those 3 ways. If it does, it's a violation of our rights. And therefore, we are not equal under that particular law. And so we've got to be equal in those 3 ways. Number 4, the rights which have been bestowed by the Creator on each individual are unalienable. Unalienable, your next blank. Which means we cannot be alienated from them without the person that did the alienating being held accountable to nature or accountable to God. That includes ourselves. Like what happens if we decide to run across a busy freeway? Is there a punishment?
Yeah.
What is it?
Death.
It's death. Because we alienate ourselves from life, and what's the punishment for alienating ourselves from life? Death. Okay? And so there's a punishment. You will be punished if you alienate yourselves from fundamental rights. Now we have a couple different types of rights. There's unalienable rights and there's vested rights. Any idea, well, first of all, who wants to tackle the definition of vested? What does that mean? Vested. Earned? Yeah, or
Given to.
given? Okay, given, exactly. So it's a given or an earned right. And usually in our society, a vested right is something that's given to us, but it's usually the administration of some of our unalienable rights. So for example, do you have the God-given unalienable right to move from point A to point B? Yeah, you do. How do you know that? Because you can, because you have legs, right? That's how we know. You see how self-evident that is? Now usually, this is the cool thing, whenever you discover a natural law principle, the way that you know that you've discovered it is it usually feels like you've always known it. You've always known that you have the right to move from point A to point B because you have legs, but you probably just haven't thought about it. But now that we bring it up, yeah, I've known that all along. So we do have the natural right to move from point A to point B. But do we have the right to move on any path that we want from point A to point B?
No.
No, why?
You might be trespassing on someone's property.
We might be trespassing on somebody else's property. That's right. So we're only able to do that as long as we don't invade the rights of others, right? And so we are able to move from point A to point B. Can we move as fast and quick and straight as we want with that right?
No.
We can until what?
Impede the rights of others.
Until we impede the rights of others, until we intersect the rights of another. And what do we do at an intersection? We govern it, right? Don't we govern it? Stop signs, yellow lights, whatever. Okay? So that's exactly what government is for, is to govern the intersection of rights, you see? And so what do? We have the right to move from point A to point B, but we can't take any path we want because we might abuse the property rights of somebody else. And so would it make any sense for each of us as individuals to have to negotiate our own paths and roads from, say, home to work? It wouldn't. You'd have this big confused mess of roads, which actually is why in the east here there are a big confused mess of roads, because that's kind of how it worked. Now if you come out west to Arizona where I'm from, you'll see these beautiful, nice grid streets and just very, very well done. And so basically what you have is we got together as we started moving out west and we realized, we ought to get to pool our resources together here, and we ought to negotiate and buy up our own tracts of land. We'll pave it, and we'll paint some lines on it, put some stop signs up, and so we establish these rules or these laws. And then we create a test. And we give that test to each other. And then once we take the test, if we pass it, then what do we get? get a driver's license. Now, do you have the unalienable right to drive on public roads?
No.
You don't, because who's it owned by? It's owned by the public, and so the public issues this test, and once you pass the test, now you are given a vested right. So it's an earned right. But you see how it's the administration of our fundamental right to move from point A to point B? But it's the way that we kind of organize it and kind of keep track of it and pool our resources and things. So vested right versus an unalienable right. And a driver's license, I kind of use that with some hesitation because government, like many things, has abused it. They've attached it to all these other things. You know, if you fail to pay child support, you lose your driver's license. And the founders said, no, the punishment always has to be attached to the actual crime or whatever. And so, but anyway, in its purest form, the driver's license is a vested right. Now, number 5, among the most important of the inalienable rights is the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to pursue whatever course in life a person may desire in search of happiness, peace, and property, so long as they do not invade the rights of others. Others is your blank there. So the most basic reason, or the most basic reason for a community or nation to set up a system of government is to make sure that these rights are protected, your next blank, protected and preserved. Protected and preserved. You got a question?
One of the things people sometimes try to do is create laws that prevent people who are smarter or wealthier from maybe getting property for lower value than it's worth. When it comes to rights, is it the right of people to have something of equal value? I.e., property is worth $10. Someone negotiates you down to $8 because they're smarter than you and better negotiator than you. Is there a place for government to be involved with that kind of activity?
Well, in the event, if government said, no, you have to sell it at $10, then what happens to those 3 equal rights? See, they end up being unequal because now the law is making it so that you are not able to make your own decisions or your own negotiations or control your own property. So your property, if you're not able to negotiate it, your property is less value than the person that's trying to buy that property from you because they now have more of an advantage. If there's a price fixing, then they now have more advantage over you with your property than you do. So now you've made yourselves unequal there again under the law and in your rights and all that. So yeah, so this price fixing situation always fails. And eventually what ends up happening with it? Eventually government, years down the road, ends up having to catch up and the prices have to all of a sudden change quickly. Remember a few years back when California was having to do all those rolling brownouts and blackouts, right? The reason why, they had plenty of electricity. In fact, we supply them in Arizona. We supply them with a lot of their electricity with our nuclear power plant. And but we couldn't sell it to them because their government about 15 years earlier, the state government had put a cap on what electricity prices could be. Well, we had finally got to the cap to where you couldn't do it. It cost more money to produce the electricity than the price. So what happened over the course of just about a year and a half, they had to experience the price hikes that everybody else had experienced over the 15-year period. So you see, so it actually ended up hurting them in the long run because now in this year and a half period, they jumped up as high as all of the rest of us slowly went up for that 15 years. And so it always ends up catching up to us. Because whenever you try to run away from natural law, Cicero was the one that really wrote about natural law great. And he said, if you try to get away from natural law, it's like trying to flee from yourself. And in the long run, you will suffer a worse punishment. And so that's kind of what happens with some of those things. But this is why we put society together, is to try to protect our rights, make sure that they're protected and preserved. And so let's kind of explore a little bit of what we're able to do now as a society and how we're able to establish government. Do we have the right to sit at our doorstep with a garden hose in our hand, just in case our home starts on fire, we can try to put it out? Sure, we have the right to do that. Do we have the right to stand at our doorstep with a gun in our other hand, just in case somebody comes to invade our home, we can protect ourselves?
Yes.
Absolutely, we have that right. Do we want to do that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week?
No.
No. Yes? You know, I was teaching a seminar in, where was it? Oh, Asheville, North Carolina, right? Just kind of a small little place, and there was a rough character in the back. And when I asked that, do you want to do that 24 hours a day? I do. And it turns out he does. He sits at a doorstep periodically with a shotgun in his hand, just so that his neighbors kind of know who's in charge there, right? But most of us don't want to do that 24 hours a day. We want to go, to work and school, and we want to hang out with our family and friends, and we want to come to a seminar like this. And so what do? We get a hold of Fred over here, and we say, Fred, how would you like a job? I'd love a job. What do you want me to do? Well, we're going to give you some big boots and a big jacket and a big hat and a shiny red truck. And we want to make sure that truck is always full of water. And we're going to give you a phone. And when that phone rings, you better come running, because it means one of our homes is on fire. And you need to come help us put it out. Can you do that? Fred said, absolutely, I can do that. Then we go over here to Sam. Sam, how would you like a job? I'd love one. What do you want me to do? Fred's got a pretty good gig going on over here. Well, we're going to give you a uniform and a badge so that people know that we've given you some authority. We're going to give you a gun to wear on your side because we have the authority to wear a gun on our side. And we're going to give you a car, put some bubbles on top, and we want you to drive around our neighborhood just to kind of make sure our property's secured, make sure nobody's assaulting our families, and just kind of keep an eye out on things. Can you do that? Sure, we can do that. What have we just created? A police and fire department, right? And when we boil it right down to it, what is it? Government. It's government. That's right. And that's all government is. Now, why did we have the ability to create this government?
We had the right taxes.
Because we had the right. Because we ourselves had the right to stand at our doorstep with a garden hose in one hand and a gun in the other hand, and so we just simply took and delegated the administration of those rights to our agents, the government. And that all government is. It's just the delegation of rights to our agents, the government. Now, very important point. If once we do that, do we lose our right to stand at our doorstep with a garden hose in one hand and a gun in the other hand? No, we do not. And that's important to understand, especially when it comes to law enforcement. Because right now, law enforcement in today's day and age can do a lot more than the people can do, right? Where did they get that authority? If we're to operate under the premise that that government gets its authority from the people, then where did they get their authority? They either usurp it, right? Or once we give it to them, then they take it away from us. We never gave them the right to take it away from us. We just simply gave them the right to administer our rights. Okay, so it's important to remember that we don't lose our rights once we ask the government to kind of administer those rights. Now let's see how far we can take this. Okay, so we know that we can now establish a police and fire department. Let's see what else we can establish. So I live in a pretty modest home. My wife and I, we have 4 children, and we have 1 car. And it's kind of tough to get around, but we make do, and hard to get to work and things like that. But I've got over here on this side of me, there's a Smith family. Now the Smiths, just a husband and wife, no kids, but they have 2 cars. And then over here, the Joneses, husband and wife, 6 kids, no car. That's pretty rough. That's hard to get the kids to school, hard to get to work. It's just a tough lifestyle for them. And so, I'm a kind, compassionate, merciful individual. And so I really kind of start thinking, how can I help out the Joneses? I can't do it because I only have 1 car. Mr. Smith, he can probably help out. He's got 2 cars. They don't even have any kids. So I go over to Mr. Smith and have a conversation with him. Mr. Smith, do you know the Joneses? No, not really. So I begin to tell him the plight of the Joneses. Wow, that's unfortunate, he said. It is unfortunate. It's pretty tough. But I've got an idea. Why don't you take one of your cars and give it to the Joneses? Well, that's an idea, all right. Well, actually, I insist. You insist? Get out of here. I'm not going to just give my car. If they want a car, they can earn the money and get it. I work hard for my cars. I could not believe how much of a lack of compassion Mr. Smith had. This was really frustrating to me because I am a kind, compassionate, merciful individual. So this is just getting at me, this injustice, or at least what I perceive to be an injustice. And so I'm just having a tough time with this. I can't even sleep at night. So finally one night I get up, and I know a little bit about something about cars. So I go to Mr. Smith's, and I hotwire that car, and I bring it over to Mr. Jones. Knock on his door. Mr. Jones, I got a present for you. For me? Yeah, nice present for a new car. How would you like to, drive this thing around? It'd be great. Easier to get the kids to school. Easier to get to work. Sorry, I don't have a key, but if you just touch these 2 wires together, you'll do just fine, right? Wow, that's pretty. I just made a friend, didn't I? Just lost a friend too. But So I just go home, and now I go home and sleep like a baby because of how kind and compassionate I had been by making sure that Mr. Jones was taken care of. All of a sudden, 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a knock on the door. It's the sheriff. Your fingerprints are all over that car. Well, of course they are. You'd have done the same thing if you were as kind and compassionate and merciful as I am. Well, he didn't think that was a reason, so he took and hauled me off to jail. I ended up doing 5 to 6 years in the pokey, right? And I get out, and when I get out, this injustice, or at least my perception of an injustice, is still happening. 2 cars over here, no car over here. But see, I had a long time to think while I was in jail. And so I came up with a plan. And so I went around to our neighborhood. We have 100 homes in our neighborhood. And I passed out a petition that we put right on the ballot that Mr. Smith has to give his car to Mr. Jones. I'm a good campaigner. We go around, each home has 1 vote, and we go around, we campaign it well, and the election day comes, and the results, 99 for and 1 against. Of course, the 1 against is this incompassionate Mr. Jones over here, right? But nevertheless, 99 for. That's a mandate. That is the voice of the people. How can we refuse that mandated voice of the people? 99% said this has got to happen. So 99 of us go over to Mr. Smith, and we hotwire that car and bring it over to Mr. Jones. Now, if you were to do this in your neighborhood, what happens next?
Gunshots.
Yeah, gunshots in your neighborhood, yeah. Other neighborhoods, hopefully, that are a little bit more peaceful. 99 people go to jail, right? Because do you have the right to go over and take your neighbor's property and give it to your other neighbor as an individual? No. Do we magically somehow get the right collectively to take from your neighbor and give it? No, we don't. And so if we again are to operate under the premise that government gets its authority from the people, if it would be illegal for the people to do something, is it possible for the government to get the authority to do it? Of course they do it. They take that authority. Question?
Does that mean any kind of income tax, for example, takes away the property of some people for the people-created government to then disseminate?
It depends. It depends on whether or not that income tax is equal or not. It also depends on whether or not on whether or not the money is being spent equally. In fact, right as we get into the beginning of the Constitution, we'll talk about general welfare clause and some other things that will kind of help clarify that on where government gets its authority to tax and what they can spend money on. Because there's no question, we need government. We just talked about the principle. It's there to protect and preserve our rights. We just hired a policeman and a fireman to protect and preserve our rights. And obviously, in order to pay for them, we've got to collect taxes, okay? And so the question is how, and the question is what is it being paid for or spent on? So here we have a situation now where we do not have the right to take from our neighbor and give to our other neighbor. And we can't give that right to the government because if we don't have that right in the first place, how can we possibly delegate it to the government? And so this is definitely an issue or a problem. Now, what is the only way that we can get that car from Mr. Smith to Mr. Jones? If he buys it? Well, what if Mr. Jones offers Mr. Smith $1 million for that car? Does he have to sell it? No. So what's the only way? Permission, consent. That's right. Mr. Smith has to consent to have that car be transferred to Mr. Jones, whether it's buying, donating, whatever, and Mr. Smith has the total right to say, you need to earn your own car. I'm just going to throw my car away and smash it up and throw it in the garbage dump. That's his right. It's his. But what is it that gives Mr. Smith so much right over that piece of property, that binds him so closely to it, that is only by his consent that we can move that car from the Smiths to the Joneses?
Property rights.
His property rights, okay, possession. Right? Now let's explore what exactly is property and what binds us to our property so closely. Now we're going to go along with the thinking here of John Locke. John Locke was a great methodical thinker. He kind of thought things through very well. And so he's trying to think, okay, what is property? And he's thinking, all right, what if somebody is out in the wilderness? They're not on anybody's land, nobody owns it. And so basically everything that's on that land, because nobody owns it, is owned by everybody, because God gave us this earth for all of our use, is what John Locke figured. So he's thinking, okay, if somebody's out on this land, and that person comes across a wild apple tree, Okay? Who likes apples? Right? Kevin, you want to come on up here and give us a hand? We'll polish that up nicely for you there. There you go. There's a napkin just in case you make a mess of yourself. So Kevin is out in the wilderness. Again, nobody owns this property. He comes across this wild apple tree. Nobody planted it, so everybody owns it. And John Locke's thinking, okay, if everybody owns it, does it make any sense that Kevin would have to ask every single person on this earth for permission to take one of these apples? Why doesn't that make sense? What would happen if that was the case?
Nothing would get done.
He'd starve. Nothing would get done. That's right. So John Locke immediately realized that is not a correct natural law concept. And so then he thinks, okay, well, how can it become his? So Kevin's there. He sees these apples. He starts picking them. He gets a whole bushel full of them, and he carries them home, and he starts preparing and making all kinds of things out of apple. Apple pie, apple dumplings, apple jacks, whatever else you make out of apples, okay? And he's getting kind of hungry, like the rest of us are here, before lunch. He's getting kind of hungry. And so he decides to take a bite out of one of those apples. That's your cue to go ahead and take a bite. It's good. Good apple? Yeah, a little sour? A little bit. Yeah, okay. Compliments of the hotel. So, so he's eating his apple. Now, what's he doing? He's chewing it up, so he's pre-digesting it, okay? And then he's going to swallow it. And once he swallows it, his stomach's going to, see, you hit your cue just right on there. That's awesome. So as he swallows it, then his stomach is going to continue to break it down and digest it, okay? Then it's going to go into the intestines. And once it gets into the intestines, it's going to start absorbing the nutrients, right? Okay. Now we're going to stop right there in the digestive process. Okay. So at this point, whose nutrients is it? It's his. You don't want it at this point, right? It's his nutrients. So John Locke's thinking, okay, at what stage did it become his? When do you think? When did it become his?
When he picked the apple.
Okay, when he picked it. Any other ideas? When he ate it, maybe? Okay, why when he picked it?
He took possession of
Took
it.
possession. Somebody said something over here.
He did the work.
He did the work. That's right, his labor. He put something into nature that nature didn't already have, and it was part of himself. He took part of himself, his labor, and applied it into nature. Okay? Now, it couldn't have been when he ate it, because John Locke said that would have meant that from the picking to the gathering to the bringing home and preparing, that would have meant that he had stolen it all along the way. He said if it wasn't the first action, nothing else could have made it his. So it had to have been that first action where he put something into it of himself. Kevin, thanks for helping out there. Let's give him a hand. Good job. So here we have now this concept of our labor going into nature. And I want you to write somewhere in your margin there in your book, I want you to write an equation. And this equation is time plus choice equals property. Time plus choice equals property. Now, any mothers here that give their kids an allowance? Or fathers, I guess, too, give your kids an allowance? How much do you give your kids?
Their age.
Their age?
Their age.
So if they're 10 years old,
They get $10
$10 a week or a month?
a week.
A week? Okay, that's pretty good. I hope they probably work for it, right? Okay, you have to work hard for it. Now, so how old are your kids?
13, 16.
Okay, so have your kids saved up for something kind of bigger recently, and what have they saved up for?
Past like a handheld game device.
Okay, that's the number one answer I get. It's always a video game or the device or whatever. But I did get an interesting answer in Montrose, Colorado once. Now this is out in the sticks, out just in the middle of nowhere, a real small town. And I asked this 15-year-old young man, have you recently saved up for something that you're excited about or whatever? Boy, he gets this big smile on his face. Now, what did you save up for? Plywood. Plywood? I guess that's what they do for fun in Montrose, Colorado. So some kind of gaming device. And do you remember approximately how much that would have cost?
$100.
About $100. So say, for instance, that they were, we'll just, for argument's sake, say they were 10 years old at the time, so they're getting $10 a week. So how many weeks?
12.
About 10 weeks? What are you, throwing tax in?
Yeah.
So So about 10 weeks to earn enough money to buy this gaming device. So as we look at this equation, we've got 10 weeks plus how many choices did he have to make in order to obtain it?
There was a number, but.
Yeah, kind of hard to even put a number on it,
Right.
right? Because you've got choices to do the chores. I hope they've got to do chores for that. And they've got, what to buy, what not to buy, what to save up for, okay? And so so we'll just say he had to make 100 choices. So now with that equation, we've got 10 weeks plus 100 choices equals a gaming device. You see? So you took some of your time, you took some of your choices, and you purchased the gaming device with that, okay? The money is just basically a short kind of interval where you are purchasing the money first. Now I want you to change that equation to life. Isn't that what time is? Life plus liberty equals property. Life plus liberty equals property. You don't purchase things with money. You purchase things with your life and with your liberty. And you purchase money, and then you'll buy things with that. So if you make $60,000 a year and you buy a $30,000 car, and somebody steals that car from you, and you never get that car back, what else will you never get back? Remember in algebra, when your teachers taught you how to figure out an equation, what do they say? Once you take something off of the one side of the equal sign, what do you have to do to the other side? Take an equal amount out, right? So if you lose that property or that car and you never get it back, then what else do you never get back? Your life and your liberty. You see? You see how that is how we are inseparably connected to our property? All property is just the physical, tangible representation of what we have done with our life and liberty. Our property is the fruit of our life and liberty. Right? And so if we never get that car back, that thief has not only just stolen a material possession that we should just blow off, they have just stolen 6 months of our life. And they've stolen the liberty that we expanded in order to purchase that car. That's pretty significant. If anybody of you have ever been stolen from to a large degree, robbed or broken into or whatever, you notice how it feels like they literally have ripped something out of you? They have. That's why it feels that way. And sometimes you might feel guilty. Why do I feel that way? It's just material possessions. They're not material possessions. They are your life and liberty. Now the question is, what kind of value do you place on your life and liberty? You see, if you look at the property that you obtain or the property that you purchase, that tells you exactly the value you're placing on your life and liberty. Now you're thinking, oh, Bill, I wish you wouldn't have said that. There's some times in my life when I haven't placed a very high value on my life and liberty because I've wasted it. I've purchased things of low value, no value, maybe even negative value, which would be harming others and things, right? So we think about property. When we think about it, we think about our land and our car and clothing or something. But what else have you spent your life and liberty on to obtain?
Intelligence.
Our education, our intelligence, that's right. And that's why we have intellectual property, because we've spent our life and liberty to obtain it. Most definitely. What else? What about our relationships? Come on, those of us that are married know that we've sacrificed an awful lot of our life and liberty for that marriage, right? I usually don't say that so sarcastically when my wife's in the audience. But yes, we do. That is why our relationships are so precious to us, because we know that the other party has sacrificed their life and their liberty for us. My wife, when I'm out traveling around and stuff, teaching these seminars and whatnot, she's at home with our 4 little ones, and she works very, very hard to keep the home front going, making it possible for us as a family to try to get out and educate a nation on these constitutional principles. My job is to go out and stay in hotels and teach, and her job is to be there and keep the home front rolling. And we even teach our kids that they have a job as well. Their job is to be a good listener for mom. Their job is to go to school. And those things that they're doing is just as important in teaching this country about these principles of liberty as what I'm doing. And so our whole family is involved in this. And so that is very, very sacred to me, because I know that the amount of life and liberty that my wife is sacrificing for me, our relationship, and even for our country. So that's why those things are sacred. What about charity? What about the good things that you do? Don't you spend your life and your liberty to give to others? That's why charity is so sacred, because you are literally giving part of your life and liberty to somebody else. That's why you cannot be compelled to give charity, because it's no longer charity. When somebody compels you to give part of your life and liberty, what do we call that? Theft, right? Charity has got to be no strings attached in order for it to really be charity, because you are now freely giving of your life and liberty. So if the good things that you do are your property, what about the bad things that you do?
You're diminishing the value of your property.
You are. You're wasting your property. And you own it. You've ever heard the term owning your sins? You better believe it. You purchased them. You spent your life and liberty on those sins. Okay? And see, that's why sin's bad, is because God does not like waste. He doesn't like us to waste our life and liberty on things of no value or of negative value. He certainly doesn't like us to stop the ability of somebody else to use their life and liberty. You see, that's real bad. I mean, that's taking from others something that they will never, ever be able to recover when we keep somebody from being able to exercise their life and liberty to pursue happiness. So you see, all these things are our property. So if our sins are our property, then what about if we go and try to repent of those sins, try to ask for forgiveness of others and things? Isn't that our property now? So our salvation even becomes our property. Now, the reason why I bring it all the way to salvation is because Thomas Jefferson said that the ultimate level of happiness would be to return to that God that made us. The ultimate thing that he was pursuing, when we're talking about pursuing happiness, the piece of property that he wanted most was to return to that God that created us. And so you see, our property is even right up to our salvation, our pursuit of happiness, our pursuit of things of value. Isn't that wonderful? Property, doesn't it give you a totally different idea of property, and even a different view of life and what you're doing with your life and what you're obtaining with your life? Suddenly that brand new leather couch doesn't mean as much to you when you start realizing that that's your life and liberty that you spent to obtain that. And question?
I don't understand. I've always had a question about the founder. So this view of property, and like you mentioned, intellectual property, versus the patent portion, and saying that after a certain amount of time, it becomes public and everyone can own it. So
That's a great question. So patents expire, and that's a principle that the founders put in place right from the start. And so you take this intellectual property and you protect it because it is your property, but it ends up expiring. So how can that property possibly expire? And the reason why the founders said that it needs to expire is because all you're really doing is taking out of nature something that already exists. You're just discovering a natural law principle that other people will also eventually discover. That's the exact reason why Benjamin Franklin never patented one single invention of his, because he said, this really isn't mine. He said, I did spend the time and money and things to develop it, but all I did is discovered these scientific or natural law principles that exist in nature. Others can discover them too. He also wanted people to benefit from his products and his inventions. He always tried to invent things. So basically, you're given the temporary ownership of that property so that you can make a living off of it, things like that. But you can't bottle it up for forever for future generations, because those future generations may have the same type of insight and intellect and discovery and put a lot of labor and effort into it themselves, and come to find out somebody's already got this natural law principle bottled up. So that's kind of their idea of why it would expire, and why it doesn't go beyond more than just a couple of generations. So you and your children can benefit from it, sometimes grandchildren, but then that's it. Now you need to have the people actually put their labor into it again in order to benefit from it. Does that make sense? So property is a very important principle in liberty. And so because of that principle, that is why, as we already stated in number 6, we establish a society to protect and preserve our property. And number 7, because this is so, it follows that no office or agency of government has any right to exist unless they have the consent is your blank, consent of the people or its representatives. Now, the eighth principle that Thomas Jefferson included in the Declaration of Independence is if the government ever fails to protect those rights that we have consented to let them protect, then it is not only our right, but it's also our duty, which is your next blank there, our duty to change that form of government in a way that will best fit the opportunities to protect and secure those rights. Now, I love the way that Thomas Jefferson uses the word duty, because instead of just saying it's our right, and so we can just blow it off as we're just going to give up this right, it's our duty to do it for future generations. And it's very, very important that we recognize that we have to secure these rights for ourselves and our posterity, just like those who came on before us protected those rights for us. And if we aren't willing to do that, then I personally don't believe that we do not have the rights to have the freedoms that we have today, if we're not willing to sacrifice a little bit of our freedom for our future generations. So very important. Now I want to introduce you to another book. In fact, here are a series of books that are produced by the National Center for Constitutional Studies. They can be purchased there on their website. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about some of these books as we continue on through the course. We've already talked about the 5,000-year leap, but I want to draw your attention to the real Thomas Jefferson. Now, the real Thomas Jefferson, interesting that we'd use the title, The Real. Now, why would we use the title, The Real Thomas Jefferson? What's wrong with other history books that we kind of have today?
Fake.
Yeah, they're not as real, so they're fake.
Well, they've been distorted by
Don't
the
tell the real
writer.
story.
That's right, they're distorted. They don't tell the whole story, and a lot of times it's not on purpose. Basically, what happens is a biographer or a history author, they'll just go and they will read a bunch of other history books and reinterpret those and then write their own. And then so you have these multiple generations of history books. And so as things get kind of misconstrued, then before you know it, it's a total exaggeration of reality. And so when some of the staff at the National Center for Constitutional Studies got together to write these books, they went right to original source documents. They went right to the writings of the founders themselves and to their contemporaries. And they wrote the book as best they could to reflect exactly what those original documents. So we've got the real Thomas Jefferson, the real George Washington, and the real Benjamin Franklin. Now, these books are fantastic resource books because, first of all, the first half is the biography. But the second half is what we call timeless treasures from Thomas Jefferson in this case, or George Washington in that case. And basically what that is it's a list of various topics listed alphabetically, and then a quote from that particular founder on that particular topic. And so if you're doing research for a paper or a speech or something like that, then you can just go right to this part of the book and see exactly what that founder said about that particular item. So for example, if you're curious as to what Thomas Jefferson said about conquest, he's got it here. Or the Constitution, he's got it there. Continental Congress. Or debt. Oh, Thomas Jefferson was brilliant when it came to debt. You would think that he is living in our day when you go read what he says about debt, about banking and monetary systems, currency and all that. It's just amazing. So he's got some other stuff here on education. You keep going. Government, just all these different topics. Laws, lawyers. In fact, this is a funny one here. Lawyers, too many. Yeah, that's something else, isn't it? So anyway, fantastic to go through here. Now, it's very important, if you want to know what the founders believed about something, it's very important to go right back to their writings. You see, we're always hearing about how the founders did this or did that, or they didn't believe in this, or they wanted, that the whole Constitution was just written for just a bunch of rich guys. And if you really want to know exactly what they felt about stuff, you go right to their writings. So for example, remember I told you a little bit about how Thomas Jefferson was accused of being an atheist. See, when those original churches that thought that he was going to do away with these state-sponsored churches when he was running for president, they went around saying, Thomas Jefferson has never joined a church, which he never did. And they went around saying, he's never joined a church, so how can we elect a president that's already condemned to hell, and he's obviously an atheist. And so that rumor kind of started in his day. Well, around that time period, Jefferson had a friend who, by the name of Benjamin Rush, who kept asking Jefferson, what are your views of the Christian religion? And Jefferson just kept ignoring it, and he wouldn't respond, because again, he just kept that religion very, very close to his chest. And finally, after many, many years of asking that question, Jefferson finally responded to his good friend. And this is what he said. He said, "My views of the Christian religion are the result of a life of inquiry and reflection, and very different from that anti-Christian system imputed to me by those who know nothing of my opinions. To the corruptions of Christianity I am indeed opposed, but not the genuine precepts of Jesus himself." Now you got to listen real closely here because he kind of beats around the bush a little bit. "I am a Christian." Hear how subtle that was, right? "I am a Christian in the only sense in which he wished anyone to be." So he says it right there. We can go right there from Jefferson's writings to see what his political views were and what his religious views were, whether he's a Christian or wasn't a Christian, right into his writings to discover that. So it's fantastic. Most of the quotes and things that people pull out from Jefferson to show that he was an atheist or a deist or whatever are quotes that where he's actually talking badly about the churches, not about God and religion itself. And so they kind of grab these things out. Now see, he totally disagreed with the churches of the day because he felt like they had corrupted Christianity. And there were times when he could perhaps be considered a deist. Franklin referred to himself as a deist from a couple of times. But what is a deist in today's definition? Anybody want to tackle that one? What's that?
Is it agnostic?
Somewhat agnostic, but basically it's somebody who believes in a creator, but does not believe that that creator interacts with mankind at all. So basically he's a clockmaker that makes the clock, winds it up, and walks away. Okay. Now, if that was the definition of deism back then, would it make any sense that Franklin, who called himself a deist from a time or two, when he was at the convention, he stood up and said, "The longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid?" So clearly deism must have meant something different then, and it did. Basically what it meant was that they rejected mysticism. They believed that God did create the earth, created us, and put certain laws in motion, and that God himself interacts with mankind using those laws. For example, if you have 100 French ships that are coming to burn the coastal cities of America, God doesn't literally take his hand and sink those ships. He raises a hurricane and sinks those ships. Natural law principles using natural laws, you see. And so the founders, the reason why they rejected mysticism was because they saw that that is the way that the church had oppressed the people for hundreds of years. Because they said, "You can't understand God. God's too mysterious. So we will tell you what God's like. You can't understand the Bible. In fact, they even made it illegal to own a Bible. We will read the Bible and tell you what it says." And then they said, "You can't have a personal relationship with God. We will tell you what your relationship is. You can't know your standing before God. We will tell you your standing before God. And if you put a little extra money in the plate, you'll have a little higher standing with God," right? So they used that to oppress the people. They totally controlled their religious views. And they were the conduit between the individual and God. And Jefferson said, no, no, no. Franklin said, no. The individual has a personal relationship with God. So that's what they rejected as mysticism. That's what a deist was in their day, was one that believed in God, believed that God interacted with man, but used natural law principles to do so, and was not this mysterious, unknowing being. It was somebody who we could know. So anyway, very fascinating. And the reason why I bring this up about Jefferson isn't necessarily about the Christianity issue, but simply to show how we revise history by reinterpreting other history books and things. When if we just go right to the founders themselves, we can learn a tremendous amount about them. So fantastic book, The Real Thomas Jefferson, The Real George Washington, The Real Benjamin Franklin. Great books to have on your I Love America bookshelf, so strongly recommend that. Now, once Jefferson got the Declaration of Independence completed, he took that draft and they reported it to Congress, and Congress took it, and they made 60 changes. 60 is your next blank. 60 changes. But most of those changes primarily happened in that list of grievances. Remember the longest section that we talked about? The list of grievances there? And so most of those changes happened within those 60, or with those grievances. out of those 60 changes, not one change was made to those fundamental ancient principles. And see, that's kind of a difference that we had back then versus today, is they all agreed on these fundamental principles. It's just the application is what they were arguing about. Today, we tend to have a little bit of a disagreement even among these fundamental principles. And so we have some unique challenges. Now, as we see here on the top of page 14, Jefferson was not originally identified as the author. A lot of the signers, their identities were protected as well, because it was treason to do this. And so those who signed the Declaration of Independence figuratively and very literally signed that document with their blood. Because had we lost the Revolutionary War, they would have been tried for treason. Now, what's the penalty for treason? Death. Oh, it would be nice if it was only death. That's right. Basically, they'd be drawn and quartered, which the process of that is you would be hung, but not the quick breaking of the neck hanging. You would be hung until you suffocated and passed out. They would then cut you down and revive you. And then they would torture you periodically different ways, but they would eventually end up disemboweling you while you're still alive. You know what's going on. And then finally they would be merciful and they would behead you. And they would cut you in quarters, boil each quarter in a separate cauldron of oil, scattered across the countryside so that your final resting place would be unknown, unnamed, and unhonored. Would you have signed it? I used to think to myself, as I'd hear that question when I'd sit in seminars like this, would I have signed it? I'd think, oh, sure, I'd have signed it. Till I started thinking about what this really meant. My family. These men didn't just sign their own lives away, but they signed the lives of their families. Some of these men who survived the war went home to no family because their family and their homes had been killed, homes been burnt, and so that's what they sacrificed. And when I think of my 4 beautiful children and my wonderful wife, I don't know if I could sign it. It's very, very difficult to come to that conclusion. So these men did an amazing thing by committing this treason and signing this document. And so treason is your blank for letter A. Revived, your blank for letter B. Now the Founding Fathers, once they got done with this, they put together another committee consisting of Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson. Now the job of this committee was to produce the first seal of the United States. Once they're an official country, they need a seal, they need a flag, they need all these official things. And so they were there to produce that first seal of the United States. Now you'll see here on the bottom of the page an artist's rendering of what this seal perhaps looked like that this committee came up with. And John Adams expressed what that seal looked like. First of all, they had suggested that they should represent or have a representation of the Anglo-Saxons and the Israelites on the seal somehow, because those two civilizations had the first representative form of government. And they had an almost identical form of government to each other. So your next 2 blanks there, letter B, representative, letter C, identical. And so this quote here from John Adams, reporting what they had come up with, is such. Mr. Jefferson proposed the children of Israel in the wilderness, led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And on the other side, Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honor of being descended and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. Well, now that's interesting, that last statement there in that quote. When you went to your history classes and American government and political science and all those kind of classes that you went to in school, where did they tell you that we got our form of government from? Magna Carta. Well, Magna Carta, they'll talk a little bit about their history, but Greece, right? The Romans and the Greeks, the Roman Greco culture. But here's John Adams talking about the Anglo-Saxons whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. Now, our structure of government is different than the Anglo-Saxons, which we'll learn about in a minute. So clearly he's just talking about principles, the type of government, the principles that we put into government. But in school, we were taught it was from the Romans and the Greeks. Now, there's a few other quotes that I want to draw your attention to. Letter D on the top of the next page. Jefferson's great ambition at the time was to promote a renaissance of Anglo-Saxon, your next blank, primitive institutions on the new continent. Thus presented, the American Revolution was nothing but the reclamation of the Anglo-Saxon birthright of which the colonists had been deprived by a long train of abuses. And then letter E, Jefferson said, our Saxon ancestors had possessed themselves of the island of Britain and had established there that system of laws which has so long been the glory and protection of that country. And then on August 13th, 1776, Jefferson wrote to Edmund Pendleton to convince him that Virginia must abolish is your next blank, the remnants of the feudal system and return to the ancient principles. And here's what Jefferson said. Are we not better for what we have hitherto abolished of the feudal system? Has not every restitution of the Anglo-Saxon laws had happy effects? Is it not better now that we return at once into that happy system of our ancestors, the wisest and most perfect ever yet devised by the wit of man, as it stood before the 8th century? Now you see, through these quotes, it becomes very clear where we got our system of government. Primarily, we got it from the Anglo-Saxons. But yet we learned so little about the Anglo-Saxons in school. In fact, I remember as a student only ever hearing their name and never even really hearing much more. Sometimes they'll add to it and talk about the Vikings because they're so cool to talk about, right? Because they were just these warriors that went around and had these cool boats with these dragons and stuff. And so we'll hear a little bit about them, but that's it. But yet that's where our entire system of government comes from, was from our ancestors, the Anglo-Saxons. So it's very important that we understand this. So basically what we have here is we've gone through the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson. We've kind of seen the birth of our nation as far as our independence was concerned, some of the principles that Thomas Jefferson put in the Declaration of Independence. And so that concludes this lesson. And we'll continue on with Lesson 3, where we'll talk a little bit about the Constitution and how the Founding Fathers came up with some of their great ideas and what civilizations they were able to turn to in order to discover these ideas. So we hope you join us.